So what we're going to do today over the course of this session is this is going to be a session where we go through what it's like to complete a batch application form. I'm going to talk you through an approach to talk you through an approach to completing a batch application form, and then there'll be a couple of worked examples that we'll go through, and another one where you guys will have the option of doing it yourselves whilst I'm on the call, if that's what we feel we would like to do. So without further ado, let's consider a project of, so let me just see something, put something in the chat. Sure, yeah. Of course, Richard, feel free to, when we come to the relevant section, feel free to ask a question or just chuck your hand up if you'd like. So when we consider a project of 150 homes per financial year, in this example, we're just going to have 20 of each archetype, with the exception of some private rented sector and social housing properties that contribute to a greater number of properties. Sorry, everyone's just happening to chase me at this moment. Yeah, so we'll consider a project of 150 homes. What that breakdown isn't really essential, but it's just good to know that's the amount of homes that we're going to deliver in a financial year. For this project of 150 homes, for the purposes of this case study, that would mean that the project is entitled to 15 social housing homes and 15 park homes. And the homes that we put on the previous slide are actually within those parameters. So we know that the total our total allowances are things that we're going to meet. So what we're going to do as part of that is we're going to submit these homes in 8 separate batches, and we're going to split them out by archetype. So there'll be a single batch for park homes, there'll be a single batch for social housing infill, there'll be one batch of solid walled, a flat block of solid walled flats, there'll be 4 batches of mixed terraces, and there'll be a final batch of mixed terraces with a PRS, which I've now realised actually adds up. No, it does add up to 8. Okay. When you go to fill in a batch form, you will need to have 5 key pieces of information filled out. So what that is of course you'll need to know the number of homes that are within that batch. If we think of a single batch, you'll need to know the cost of the homes of each type of archetype in that batch. You need to know the cost and the grade of measures, which of the batch that you're submitting, and of course these 2 things have their own cost caps. You'll need to know the additional capital expenditure that you're going to spend on the batch in terms of things like trustmark lodgements, so those that are not related to measures but might be logged as capital. And you'll also need to know the amount of upfront money you've already spent today on those homes. From these 5 pieces of information, you can build a batch. Oh, Richard, yeah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Monty. It's really around the upfront money and the additional capital expenditure.
Sure.
And the impact on cost caps. So in your points 2 and 3 here, you've said that the cost of homes and the cost of the measures, they've got the cost caps against them, and that's linked to the archetype, etc. But we've got the upfront costs for preparation, customer journey management, all of these other things, and then any additional sort of prep works that are outside of a capital measure. So do those sit outside of the cost caps in the calculation?
No, so sorry, this is probably a bit unclear. So they do sit within the archetype cost caps. So right. Your cost of home will equal actually it's in the second bullet point. So the cost of homes equals the cost of measures plus your additional capital expenditure plus the upfront money you've spent already. I guess it's just that there isn't a distinct cost cap for the additional capital, capex, or the upfront money.
Okay, so whenever we get the total cost of properties, even though we can kind of move some of these upfront costs between archetypes to balance it out, they still come in the overall cost cap that we need to apply to the batch as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll actually, there's a really good work example that we'll go through where we can make this a bit clearer. But yeah, exactly that. So from this information, you can build a batch. So of course, the first point that it's worth remembering is that there's a limit to the number of park homes and social homes that you can submit. As Richard has just made really clear, so the cost of homes, so the cost of your archetype cost cap, must equal the cost of measures plus any additional capital expenditure you've spent plus upfront capital that you've spent upfront on that batch, with of course the upfront money being able to be spread across the archetypes within the batch that you submit. The most expensive homes or measures within the same property type, i.e. above the cost cap, can only be submitted after cheaper ones, i.e. those below the cost cap, have been submitted. That would mean that you would have built up headroom, which means that you can then exceed a cost cap. Upfront costs and additional capital expenditure can be spread across all homes in a given batch. And as I've said just there, if it's helpful for you, if you find that some of your upfront money, is too expensive, it takes out too much of certain archetypes, you can use the underspend in some of your more expensive archetypes to cover the upfront cost of homes from those less expensive ones. So what that simply means is that, you know, upfront costs roughly work out to about £900 per property. That's going to have more impact on flats. If you want to move that money from flats to the end terraced properties in your batch, you can do that. What that means, although, is that fewer measures can be installed in those more expensive archetypes in the long run. So it might just be simpler to put the costs where they should be to avoid unintended consequences later on. So there is a trade-off in doing this, but we want it to be flexible and to work for you. And obviously we want as many batches to be accepted as possible. Any questions so far? Cool. Oh, okay, sure. No, feel free to come in. It's okay.
I was just going to say, Monty, with Richard on this one, the upfront costs are in terms of surveys and all the rest of it. Is that, I didn't think that was classed as capital expenditure.
So you have the option of logging surveys and upfront money as capital or A&A, depending on what works for your local authority. So this is more just about if you do end up capitalizing those costs. This is just a process of doing them. But yeah, you have as much option to move them into A&A as you would like. We're not prescriptive about that. So really, it's just whatever works for you. So then in terms of the process for actually completing that batch form, so obviously homes enter the batch system based on homes that have been signed up. So they're often in response to demand rather than kind of you actively going out and identifying some of those homes. And this can make it a bit tricky to fill out a batch form. So what we've proposed is there are obviously loads of different ways you could go about identifying how much money you have to spend on things. The way that we recommend it and how we recommend you fill out the form is just simply to first of all calculate how much money you've spent upfront, assessing the batch. So what your static costs are across your project, then calculate how much additional capital expenditure you would need to make that batch work. So okay, then when you account for your kind of trustmark lodgement fees and some of your other expenditure, and from that information you can identify how much money you have left to install in the properties, which measures can be afforded in their respective homes based on their specific costs and your remaining tolerances. And therefore, from all of that information, you can build up and identify what your overall archetype costs are. You would then adjust the homes that are included in the batch. So you might need to include other homes in that batch to spread the costs across, across them, or you might just remove one of your more expensive homes and save it for later. So it's just a kind of accounting trick. But it's just, obviously this is a really dynamic process. So in some instances, it might mean combining batches. In other times, it might mean splitting them out. If we move to some example costs, so some of the costs will just be, can we change what we capitalize across projects? So on this, just to answer Andrea's question, so can we change what we capitalize during the project? So as far as I'm aware, it always has to be consistent. What you can do is at a later point in time, you can submit a change request where you can edit a previous batch that's been submitted if you choose to alter how you've capitalized certain costs. It's just important that it's consistent across the entire scheme. So if you have always capitalized EPCs, if you've capitalized EPCs today, they always have to be capitalized. Otherwise, you'll need to edit every pre-existing batch. So yeah, entirely up to you, but it should be consistent. So some of these costs will be similar. So when we look at some example costs, some of these costs will be similar across all homes. So for example, EPC assessments are standard, PAS dwelling assessments are standard, Trustmark lodgement fees are standard. So some of those static costs will always be £350 per home. I'm just going to say now, these are just some estimate costs, so please don't take these as gospel. Some of the costs will be on average the same or the same for a given archetype. So for example, PAS compliance costs such as ventilation, repointing, things like that could be anywhere between £250 to say £650 per home in this example, with an average of £450 per home. And some properties might require enabling works. So solid wall terraced homes will require an additional £1,667 per unit, or for a block of flats that would be about 20k. Then on top of that, some costs will be variable and dependent on individual properties. So you might have some pre-work costs, you might have post-work costs. Again, some of these can be capitalized, some of them can be put in as A&A. Some costs are unforeseen. I do take that point. I think it's just for the purposes of this example, we're going to use some rough costs just to make filling out that batch easy. Obviously, I appreciate it's a bit more complicated in practice. And it will require a home by home approach, but at least having some sense of what your ongoing costs are probably a sensible approach. What that means is that in practice, you should always factor in your static costs of around £800 to £1,250 per home in before you begin assessing for measures. And for solid wall properties, this rises to a max of £2,250 per home, which then impacts what measures you want to put in at a later point in time. Obviously, again, as has been pointed out in the comments, those are subject to change, and so we've created a system where you can reopen some existing batches. It'll be mentioned in the delivery guidance. So yeah, there'll be the option of being able to reopen a batch and change some of those costs in practice and within reason. So obviously some costs will change, but we allow you to do that in practice. Sure, Richard, do you want to come in?
Sorry, Marty, I'm very needy today. If you could just go back to the previous slide.
Sure.
I want to talk about some of the kind of real life experience we're seeing in Hug One. So with EPC assessments, we're tending with some suppliers that we always get a pre and a post EPC assessment. So has that been factored into your example costing?
In this case, it has not, or you can take the EPC cost as because that's logged as an additional cost. You could take it as £50 pre and post, so £100 per home across. I think,
yeah, just think with real life examples, Monday, £100 is not going to cover 2 EPC assessor visits and 2 EPCs getting produced and uploaded.
That's completely fine. What I will say is I did try and come in originally with some more realistic costs. I think just for the purposes of these kinds of exercises, I think we perhaps thought it was better to have just kind of simple costs. But yeah, I fully recognize that these are not what you're going to see on the ground. And so yeah, I can't really say much more beyond that. But yeah, I'm fully aware £100 is not going to cut it.
Yeah, but just again in the batch form in terms of classifying where that EPC cost for a post EPC sits, will we have spent it at the point? Would we count that as part of an upfront EPC assessment cost because we know we need to complete that post EPC as a requirement, or is that something that we would put into another area?
No, so you could log it as a additional. You could either log it as upfront money because you're technically spending it before you've or you're agreeing to spend it before you've spent your money. Before you've started the works on the home. You could also log the second one as additional capital, I guess, because it's a static cost. So the cost of actually doing the EPC will be the same for both. Am I mistaken there?
I know the cost will be the same for property because we'll do a pre and a post.
Yeah.
One of the issues that we're finding is even if there's fairly recent EPCs, they're not necessarily very accurate, and we're tracking this as part of some of the data we're looking at in schemes.
Yeah, sure.
So we're more comfortable with the pre and a post EPC, and then we've got a relevant measure for the change of the property. It's better for benefits measurement as well if we do both.
Completely with you on that part. And yeah, I fully hear the rationale for having two EPCs done. I meant more like, in this example, would it be £50 for the pre and post? There's not going to be a different cost for your post EPC.
No, it's unlikely. It'd be it's the same activity, it's the same fee basically.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that you can just log that as an upfront cost. Again, it's just important to be consistent. Josephine, just so that we can make sure we're all on the same page, you can log enabling works as capital spend. I know that I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but capitalization is entirely up to you, and I think it will come with practice deciding how you want to do this. So in the sense of if you would like to log enabling works as CapEx, you can do that. If you find that you're running out of your CapEx and it's impinging the measures you can install, you can obviously go back and change that and turn that into A&A. It's just important for it to be consistent. So yeah, I think looking at your starting costs and looking at your kind of started estimated running costs for things like enabling works, although I am just to note, I am generally, although we use enabling costs here, it's kind of a broader term. I've just tried to group in a load of different costs. So generally enabling works like ancillary would be under A&A. Okay. So moving on. Justin.
Just picking up on the question I've put in the chat, just that we've sort of experienced had the need and previous sustainable want scheme to capitalise some of our sort of A&A budget. And I just sort of think, and I've sort of put the question in the chat because I think that then just sort of falsely gives an indication of cost of measures across different schemes when you sort of compare the sort of capital costs of the measures. And I just think it would not be easy for DESNZ or department to just specify exactly what is capital and what's A&A. Because you start with one thing and then having sort of to change it, put in change requests, and having to balance a number of sort of criteria and budgets and things, and that's you kind of always trying to sort of basically manipulate the figures to make it fit within the constraints of the funding, and it's just becomes a bit of an additional sort of we sort of found sort of nightmare trying to sort of find the right balance.
That's completely fine. What I will say is I'm just going to see if I can pull it up right now, or I can get you an answer. Basically, the long and the short is that we are about to publish some delivery guidance, and in that it more specifically states where we expect what we would consider to be A&A and capital expenditure. So it's not published yet. It will be soon, so I can't necessarily I won't put it in the chat at this moment in time. But yeah, I really hear what you're saying, and we are publishing guidance on what we expect in more detail to be CapEx and what we expect to be A&A. Is that okay?
Does that sort of include also, obviously there's things like enabling around sort of things like UK Power Network. We've got like UK Power Network works to connections to properties where we're doing certain measures and things, but then also things like the ventilation requirements under PAS. Does that require those sort of specific types of what you could class as enabling, or what you could class as part of the actual capital measure work?
So I think that the rule we've applied is where it is directly tied to, as in it would be incapable of doing for the specific capital measure itself, that is capitalizable, and anything else that's considered enabling or on the side. I haven't been too close to the detail. All I know is that our commercial colleagues have put in more guidance on that. So yeah, I think it's where it's solely tied to the actual installation of the measure is what we would expect to be capitalized, and everything else would be A&A. So yeah, I would say wait for the delivery guidance that is coming very shortly. And if you do have additional questions, if you could email those to us. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't be more help on that at this moment in time, but I will make sure that we do have some clearer guidance for you.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. I am just going to just move on because I'd like to get through an example, but I'm happy to pick back up on questions at the end if that's okay. I'm just aware that we have an example to get through, and then yeah, happy to take on any more questions or take any away. Yep. So moving forward, so you'll obviously have contracted specific installers. You'll know roughly what measures you are able to do in the kind of parameters that your retrofit assessor will work. So in this example, we've considered 9 separate measures. They, of course, every measure has a specific grade. It has a type, so it relates to one of the individual cost caps of energy efficiency and low carbon heat. And certain measures are relevant to certain property types. So, for example, air source heat pumps you can put into any, whereas for the purposes of this exercise, solar PV will only consider in the parameters of a terraced home. So, practical example. So 20 owner-occupier homes are signed up and assessed for measures. There's 4 cavity wall terrace properties, 6 mid-terrace properties that are solid wall, 4 end terrace cavity wall properties, and 6 end terrace solid wall properties. The properties are assessed for measures, and on average, these are the measure costs you receive for those properties. So again, I know that these might not be representative of the costs you're receiving, just an example. So mid-terrace to end terrace properties will range between £2,000 per property to £4,000. Solid wall will be 6,000 to 12,000. By these costs as well, we accept that we want all homes to receive air source heat pumps, so they're 10K. We all want properties to have an upgrade to wet central heating systems, and we also want 60 units of double glazing across the scheme, so where each unit is £2,000 per unit. In terms of additional, yeah, I'm aware that the costs are a little bit incomplete. Yeah, properties will also require enabling work, so that'll be 1,667 per solid wall property, £9,000 for pre-building works in total, an additional set of £450 for PAS compliance costs, along with your standard EPC, PAS assessments, and Trustmark lodgement costs, which in total come to £350. I am happy to go through and, using this information, fill in a form live, and then we can have a conversation about what the outcomes are, what it means for you guys. So that's what I'll do. If you have any questions whilst I'm doing it, please shout out, raise your hands. And also, just before we go on, I know there's been a couple of questions in the chat about smart controls. So smart controls, you can start installing from now, in terms, because yeah, you can start submitting properties with smart controls. I will take away the questions on battery systems. I'm not the measures lead, but I can definitely make sure that a response is provided as to whether you can start putting them in now. But smart controls, I know, is a definite yes. Richard.
Yeah, Monty, again, this is just something that's really important for us in terms of supplier spec. We've got to make a choice as to whether we include it in what we ask suppliers to do or not. And if there's going to be a change partway through the scheme, that's something that needs to be managed quite carefully in terms of introducing new measures, and potentially earlier householders who've gone through batches will be disadvantaged because that measure is not available when it's available later on in the scheme. So yeah, there's a lot of implications around this. So we're quite interested in understanding where we're going to be with it, and either include it or exclude it from the scheme, yeah, almost in totality.
Yeah, no, I completely hear you on that. I think that's a really good point. And yeah, I will get you an answer ASAP. I'm aware that this has been raised to us separately. The reason I know about smart controls is because someone else made this point. I just haven't been close enough to batteries to know what the official policy is, but I will come back to you and I'll make sure that that's distributed. And I can actually see if it can be included in the delivery guidance as well. So yeah, we'll definitely take that away. So this is a form, as you'll have seen before. So when we think about how we fill this out, so using the approach that was suggested before, the first thing we would do, and I'll just ignore all of this stuff on the side, is we would fill out the example of our housing stock assessment. So we know that we have 4 solid walled cavity flats or a cavity mid-terrace properties. We know that we have, and of course you would split them out by EPC, but I think for these purposes we'll just keep them as individual EPCs. They're all the same EPC. For our solid wall flat, we would do We have 6 mid-terrace solid wall flats, 4 solid walled end terrace properties. That's fossil fuel property for change, and 6 end terraced solid wall properties, giving us a total of 20 properties. The first thing we would do is we would go down and we would fill in the kind of static costs that we know that we have. So that's EPC assessments, PAS dwelling assessments, and the pre-building works that we said that we needed. If you want to open the slides alongside this, you can do. So we know that we have 20 EPC assessments that are required at £1,000. We know that we have 20 PAS dwelling assessments at a total of £4,000, and we know that we have 20 sets of pre-building works that need to occur at a total of £9,000. That means that all of our upfront money, we've spent £14,000 in upfront costs so far. Moving on, we know that the additional capital required to make this work at this point in time will total £30,000, and we know that because for our PAS compliance costs, of which there will be 20 properties, we will know this is £9,000 based on the cost that we've already received. I can't see hands, so I'm just going to. Okay, great. Yeah, no. If I don't respond to you when you've raised your hand, please just shout out because I can't see. We know that your Trustmark lodgement fees again will need to lodge every property, and again they will cost £1,000. And we know that we want to do some enabling works at this point in time for the solid wall properties. Solid wall. And those will cost a further £20,000. Based on those costs, we can then go and also fill in the measure costs. So we calculated off the back of this from the total amount of money that we would be entitled to, that we have a net loss, or we've already spent £44,000, or there'll all be £44,000 less of measures that we can receive for this property or for these properties. So then with our measure costs that we got after that, we can fill that in as well. So for our cavity walled properties, we know that there will be 8 of them, and we know 4 will be at £2,000 and 4 will be at £4,000, which gives us a grand total of £24,000. We know for our solid wall flats, for our solid wall homes, 6 of them will be at £6,000. So it's 6 times 6 is 136, and we know a further 6 will be at £12,000, which is, we get mental maths, 72, which all in all gives us a total of £108,000. After that, every property is going to receive an air source heat pump, and that will be 200k. And finally, we know that every property wants to receive wet central heating. We want to upgrade their wet central heating, and they were £4,000 per unit, giving us a total of £80,000. Just going to check if there's any hands. Great. Okay. I'm sorry if this is painful to watch, but it's just good that we do it all together. Again, double glazing, £4,000 per unit. Should be £20,000. So with all of that, those costs together, we can then start building our costs for our overall archetypes. So first of all, we know that the cost of our air source heat pumps. So here we know, for example, that 4 times 10,000, or 6 times 10,000. We know that that one is 4. And we're getting 4 air source heat pumps here. Finally, we want 6 air source heat pumps here. We also know that our cavity wall insulation, so for our mid-terrace properties, to see here. So I'm just checking what I said would go where. It's actually 2,000 because they're also getting like central heating. Okay, so sorry about that. So the cost of the low carbon heat measures that we want to put in, air source heat pumps and wet central heating, maximize our low carbon subsidy available, which means that any upfront costs and additional costs need to be spread across the properties that they will be in. When we then go to do our energy efficiency costs, therefore any kind of additional upfront costs and additional capital will need to be spread into these, which therefore means that, and of course, some of those costs will be specific only to solid wall properties, and some of them will only be specific to, some of them will be specific to all properties. So based on those. So this accounts for the measures that are going into these properties plus the additional capital costs that are required. Finally, 137,200, and that's composed of the measures that we want to put in, the relative cost that those measures are, and the upfront cost where they need to sit as they currently stand. So this is what a completed batch here looks like, and you'll see at the bottom all of the costs align and they balance out. So all the costs that we have spent up front and the additional capital expenditure aligns with the total cost that we have logged for the batch. What I will jump back to is now okay, so that was a completed mixed terrace property. What you will have noticed from these end costs are that basically, because one of our cost caps exceeded its allowable cost range, it wouldn't have been accepted as a first batch because the cost of treating those end terraced cavity wall properties are outside of the cost caps, and that was because of the additional enabling costs that were required in there. And what that meant was that we exceeded the energy efficiency cost cap that was available. And I'll just move to here so you can see what that looks like. So when we logged all of the upfront costs alongside those, it pushed our energy efficiency cost up for our cavity walled solid wall properties. I mean, cavity walled end terrace properties. What we could have done to remediate this problem is we could have transferred the majority of those upfront costs into properties of other archetypes. So the static costs for upfront capital for our end terraced, for our solid walled properties, for our end terrace properties were 1,167 as a standing cost. So there was some slack in some of the other cost caps that you could have moved that into that would have then enabled it to be accepted. Another option that would, of course, you'd still have some leftover upfront capital that you'd need to move across that are solely tied to the measures. So something else you could potentially consider doing is reducing some of the measures that you put in the property. And I know that sounds quite controversial, but removing a single unit of double glazing from one property would be enough to save the funding to allow this batch to be accepted. Or the other option is that you could just hold back on submitting those end terrace cavity wall properties in this batch until you have another batch that you can submit that might, be acceptable in that range. That's the practical example. Sorry, Richard, do you want to come on screen and talk through that question? Sorry, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. And then, yeah, Matthew, I'll take your question afterwards.
Yeah, sorry, Martin, I said I'm being very needy today. So
Okay.
this is all a balancing act, trying to get the batches through and
Yep.
getting them approved. And we've got some elements that may be capitalised or maybe A&A in terms of the upfront costs. Let's assume we've put them through as capital. If the batch gets rejected and we take one or more properties from that batch, there's no guarantee that they will actually fit in and successfully pass in another batch. So there may be no delivery against them. So the question is, what happens to the upfront costs in that case? Because if we paid them out of A&A,
yeah.
we'll have paid them potentially to supply. If we've put them in capital, you'll potentially have said, no, you can't have the capital allowance for the upfront costs.
That's fine. So we've had this question before, and generally where a property isn't progressed, we expect those costs to be put in as A&A because they don't relate to the installation of measures in an actual property that was capitalised in the first place. So yeah, log those costs as an A&A. We have the ability for you to draw down additional A&A like through the change request process. So yeah, we wouldn't expect those upfront costs to be capitalised, and they won't have been logged through the batch system, so they won't have been recorded as money that's been paid out.
Yeah, so if we'd resubmitted the batch, we would take out the upfront costs for the properties that we'd removed as well.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly that. It's also worth noting that because, again, you can reopen batches at a later point in time. So let's say I know that there's been some conversation in the past about, can we add more measures later on? And, where you have allowable costs and there are some homes where you feel like you can do that and you have allowable space in your headroom where you have a bit of extra space in some of your cost caps, you can, of course, go back and do those properties, add additional properties as needed. Next one. Sorry, there was another hand that I saw go up, but it's gone down. Sorry. Josephine, do you want to come up and ask your questions? Or Sandra, or it just, yeah, I think it'd be good for people to come on screen, if that's okay.
Just wanted to ask, so if at the point where a batch is rejected and we're delivering by geography, does that mean that we might have to put in 2 batches for the same area? Because we've got a strategy to deliver by geography because we've got such a expansive area.
I'm sorry, so sorry, you're submitting a batch based on this geographic area that you're going to deliver in, and then sorry, what was the second part of the question?
So if for instance one home on a street had to come out with a batch, we'd have to put them in a different batch to get the street done at the same time. So we might be doing multiple batches just to make sure that the accounting works. Does that?
Yeah, that is right. What I would say though is because you're already, so hopefully you'll obviously be tracking all of the costs that you have to date. So I basically, like, you'll know before you submit a batch. You should know generally before you submit a batch whether it'll be approved or not, because you'll have your own records of costs. So because of course you're doing area-based delivery, it might just be worth, if you know that some homes in a batch are going to exceed some of your cost caps, you can either then make the choice to submit that batch in 2. But of course, to enable area-based delivery, it might be worth waiting 1 or 2 weeks until you get other homes, a different batch you can submit in, so you can submit that as one batch, because obviously we green light only some of the delivery. We only green light the delivery of the homes that you submit through a batch. So obviously breaking that into 2 has its own challenges, and we want to make it as easy for you as possible.
Right.
So you can submit it in 2 batches. It would be easier to edit that batch ever so slightly, reduce some of the measures, or wait for another batch to go ahead of it to enable that whole batch to be submitted and approved. That might also be another way of doing it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
This is a completely new system as well, so I appreciate that this seems really fiddly and tricky. We're hoping that it works out, and we obviously want to know, and we want to enable this to work a lot better. So either Sandra or Andrea, do you want to come forward?
Oh, Andrea here. I just recall I came to the first training session. I'm sure they said that you could borrow if your clean heat was above certain your cost caps, that you could borrow from your energy efficiency cost caps.
Yes. So where you have energy, where you have clean heat that's not the standard ones, so not like an air source heat pump. So for things like ground source heat pumps, combined shared ground loops, biomass, I guess, in some instances. So where you have those non-standard complete heat measures, where you provide justification as to why those are more expensive, yes, you can borrow from your energy efficiency cost caps. So there's a question in the batch form that asks you if you've done that and why.
Oh, right. Okay. So it'll be obvious when we start doing it where to answer that question. Yeah,
exactly. And the automatic system.
Oh, then it'll turn it to green.
So the form won't, because the form is inbuilt, but you on our automated system, you can leave a comment for the delivery partner, so it'll be really clear where you've done things, basically, and it will. Okay. Cool. Next question.
It's Sandra. Could you just clarify what you mean when you say reduce some of the measures that you put into the properties? Are you saying like not do one of the measures, or do you mean put that measure into another batch? Removing a measure, would that not impact on the SAP rating?
Yeah, so we do, when I say you can remove a measure, you can do one of those things. It wouldn't be, so you can either so what I imagine the pathway is, so obviously you have your upfront cost, you know what that's going to be. You then have a remaining pot of money that's left for those homes to treat them based on the spend you've done to date so far. With that, you would go and get a medium-term plan done. You'd have a retrofit assessment, and that would provide you with a set of costs based on the recommended measures. From there, before those are offered to the household, you'd obviously decide which ones are cost effective and you think that they would do. And obviously there's some back and forth about what they're able to take. So yeah, you could because obviously you make the decision based on the cost as to what measures go into a home, and then you develop your SAP rating, right? You wouldn't get a SAP rating based on every single measure that's recommended in the property, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, thank you.
Great. There is another worked example that we can do, in the sense of I'm happy to leave this one on the screen and you guys can go off and do it, and then we can ask questions about it if you'd find that helpful. If you'd rather ask some more questions about the batch form, we can do that, or the batch process. Really open up to what you guys want to do. We'll need a response. Okay, all right. Yeah, so you would need to, especially with consortia, but yeah, every project will need to track its allowances against the spend that it's got. So you would be doing that kind of accounting. You would be doing that accounting based on the batches that you've submitted to date. In order to know kind of how much headroom you do have. One thing that you could do that I think is quite that might be sensible is, although it might be a bit fiddly, is because a lot of the hard coding is built into the actual batch form that's on gov.uk. So what you could do is just every time you want to put in new measures, or you want to add another home to the properties, or you want to add more homes to your project, you can actually just fill in, like cumulatively fill in a single batch form. Obviously you wouldn't be able to submit that to us, you'd submit us the individual batches, but then that'll tell you how much of each allowance you've got, whether you've got any headroom left, because of course it provides you with an average cost of measures to date, average cost of spend to date, and things like that. So yeah, you can just use one batch form to kind of cumulatively check all of your costs, if that's helpful. Sure. Okay, what I will do then is I'll leave this one on screen. If you guys, I'll give it kind of 5 minutes. If you want to try and fill it out, and I can stay here, and then in 5 minutes I'll go through kind of the response or what it would have looked like to fill that in, and then I'll draw the session to a close or give a bit more space at the end for questions. So I'll just leave this here and give you 5 minutes and we can come back to it.
While everyone's working on that, I'm still working on the SAP ratings. I wonder. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to work out what I'm meant to be doing on the SAP bands. Sorry,
That's fine.
I'll go off again.
I was just drafting your response. The long and the short is basically that, as it says in the batch form, you should have the aspiration to raise a property by 2 EPC bands. So EPC bands, F and G homes, aspire to raise to at least band E, and E and D bands up to a C. So of course it's not 2 bands, it's where applicable 2 bands. And if you aren't able to raise the property by 2 EPC bands, we want you to take a fabric first and value for money approach in doing so. So that should be really clear based on the measures that you select and things like that. But yeah, no, it's not a requirement of the scheme that the properties end with a 2-band improvement.
Oh, thank you. Could you pop that in? I'll forget because I'm going straight on to another meeting. Could you just pop that reply in the chat as well? Thank you.
We'll give it 1 more minute and then I think we can just go through the answer, and then yeah, any more questions you have. I'd also like to just say that, if you want, I know this was a request of some local authorities to have a session like this where we could go have an example of going through a batch form, seeing what it was like to fill in. So if you'd like to have more of these, if there are other things that you would like out of these kind of, if you'd like more sessions from the department, different things, yeah, more than happy to do that as well. Again, I can't say it enough. This is a really new process, and obviously we anticipate that there's going to be there's already been some challenges kind of with HUG 1. We anticipate that there might be, we just want to make sure that this is as smooth a process as possible. So yeah, if you ever have any more questions or you want us to do a specific session on something, we're more than happy to arrange those for you. So please do keep in touch about them. Okay, so in this example, I'll just move on really quickly. So in this example, we had 20 homes in a block of flats that were assigned up and assessed for measures. There were 20 solid wall flats, 15 of those were owner occupier, 5 of them were social housing infill, and of course the social housing landlord has agreed to pay half of their costs of upgrading the homes. The cost of solid wall insulation is 120k for the block. 40 units of double glazing across the block cost £1,000 per unit, and every flat within the block will receive 3 high retention storage heaters, 2 of which are large, 1 of which is medium. So at a total cost of £1,900 to the property. I live in a solid walled flat block, and yeah, this is what happened to my house. So this will also require, as part of the solid wall installation, some supportive works and scaffolding, which will cost 20k in total. Pre-building works of £9,000, PAS compliance costs of £450 per home, and of course the standard costs of £350 per property. In the first instance, we would fill in our housing stock assessment, which is just 20 solid walled flats. In this example, oh god, it looks like I've only filled in, this is an old one, only on owner occupiers, but we'll keep going. So yeah, 20 owner occupied properties, and again the standard costs filled in at a total of £14,000. There are standing costs this time of £30,000, so similar to before, so your total standing costs of 44k. Substituting that into the looking at the costs and then substituting those into the measure mix, you have 120k under grade A measures for the solid wall property, a further 80k on the double glazing, sorry, 40k on the double glazing, and a further 40k roughly on the high retention storage heaters. I filled this out for both the flats and for both the owner occupier and the social housing landlord costs, with the costs split across that block 3-to-1 for the flat and for the social housing landlord, and then separating out the amount of money, which of course will be 50% for the social houses, for the grant to pay, and the other 50% for the social housing landlord. Costs balance, and so we know that's all fine. And as a result, what we would notice is that, again, this batch wouldn't be accepted if it was submitted as your first batch. The reason being is because grade C measures have exceeded 10%. So what you could do in this example is you could submit this batch second, after the first batch that we had submitted in the first round, or the first example had been submitted already, therefore allowing the grade C measures to be installed, because they would then be less than 10% of the total spent to date. You can actually combine this with the first batch, which I think is often we think about removing batches from one another, but you can actually just merge them all together, and you could actually do something else where you allow some of the overspend in that first batch to then be substituted into these costs, because we have a bit more headroom. And actually, because there's actually some underspend in these cost caps, you can also just go back and decide to install some more measures, because you have the headroom that's available, and that's something that we really want you to encourage, is where you have headroom and outside of the amount that you might want to plan for future homes, where you have a bit more headroom, feel free to install additional measures. We think that's a really, really good approach. So yeah, that's the second practical example gone through. I developed a load of testing products for kind of our own assessment systems. If you guys would feel those would be handy, they kind of follow along this entire exercise. So as I said, there were 8 batches, so I developed 8 batches as part of that testing. Happy to share them so you can kind of see how those have worked, what they look like for a kind of project of the. Okay, great, that's really good to see. I'll obviously have to quality assure them, but yeah, definitely happy to do that for you. With that, we're going to bring the session to a close, unless there are any more questions. So if you have. Yeah, sure, of course. This PowerPoint is already included in the session event. So yeah, you can go back and take a look at these and the 2 completed batch application forms. Yeah, any more questions? What I would also say is I will take away some of the questions, I'll rewatch this, but if you could just drop us an email as well, yeah, I just don't want to miss anything that's really urgent. So please feel free to write to our hug.project inbox, and I will make sure that those responses are pulled out as quickly as possible. Any more for any more? Otherwise, we'll call it a day. Tandem Townsend will not be able to support you when you fill in your first batch application. They only support you up until the DAC. I'm really glad to hear it. I'm really glad to this has been a great session. Okay, thanks guys. Take care. I'll circulate everything and I'll make sure this is uploaded to the Home Upgrade Hub. Have a good day, guys. Bye.